And these are my friends who've just moved here from Alabama.
Hello, nice to meet you.
Well, she works at the John Dickinson Mansion.
In case you don't know me, I'm Byron Marin. I'm the president of the Quaker Hill Historic Preservation Foundation. We begin, this ceremony has been going on for years and years and years. I'm not sure how long, but it's an annual event, and we really appreciate you being here. We'll begin with the singing of the Freedom Song, and it's significant because John Dickinson wrote the words to the Freedom Song. You'll find out a lot about John Dickinson today. We'll begin with the Freedom Song, sung by Marissa Robinson, accompanied by Linnea Raphael. Then we'll move into the next room. We should try to sit on this side so that the speakers can project in one direction, but as much as we can. We have a nice crowd, so maybe we may fill up that whole side. That's wonderful. And let's fill the whole room. So we'll begin, and then we'll have a few words from Evelyn Swenson, who is a direct descendant of John Dickinson. And known as a, well, I'll say a direct descendant, maybe not, but a descendant. Very well known throughout the state. Then we'll have a talk by John Sweeney about John Dickinson. Then we will have a eulogy, which I will read, by Jane Calvert about John Dickinson. Then we'll proceed out to the grave of John Dickinson, right through this door, out to the grave, which is in the corner of the graveyard, right at 4th and Washington. It's right on it's the corner gravestone right on the end. Then we'll proceed, if you can handle all this, we'll proceed to 521 West Street, where we have refreshments as described as victuals and libations. So, and please join us there at 521. It's just a block up West Street, right at the corner of 6th and West, opposite the cathedral. So, we hope you enjoy it, and without further ado, Marissa and Linnea. Welcome again to the Friends meeting. Again, I'm Byron Marin, President of the Quaker Hill Historic Preservation Foundation. This event is presented jointly by the Quaker Hill Historic Preservation Foundation and the Friends of Dickinson Mansion. As I mentioned, it's an event that's been going on for years and years. And we honor John Dickinson. Now, I have actually a lot in common with John Dickinson. We're both Delawareans. John, as a young man, went on to London to study law. Actually, I went on to London to study law as well. John, took him 59 days or so on a boat to get to London. It took me 7 hours by plane. John studied at the Middle Temple. I studied at the Middle Temple. I spent a lot of time in Quaker Hill. My office is down the street, and hopefully everybody will join us for refreshments. I spend a lot of time in Quaker Hill. John spends all of his time there. So today, our next speaker will be Evelyn Swenson, again a descendant of John Dickinson. Many of you may know her as opera singer, choral director, many functions throughout the entire state of Delaware, and I assume elsewhere, who would like to say a few words about her relationship to John Dickinson and a little history of John Dickinson. Without further ado, Evelyn.
Thank you very much. In about 1969, my father was the colonel in the Army, and he was in charge of the Army War College, which is right up in Pennsylvania, across the street from the college that we all know about. Well, I was so pleased when I heard my father tell me this next story. He said, you know, we knew that we had one more place to go in the Army, and then we found out that the John Dickinson mansion was for sale. And so they called a realtor, and they came down because they wanted to buy it. But they had never seen it, and they said, well, we think it just has 2 rooms up above, bedrooms, and downstairs there's just a living room and a dining room, and just a little teeny kitchen. And so it'd be just the right size for a retirement place for us. And we love things about John Dickinson. So they came down not knowing that there was an air base there. And woo, and my mother said, how often do those planes go across? And they said, oh, about every 10 minutes. So that was the end of that. But you see, then it was the Colonial Danes who bought the place and fixed it up and gave it to the state and started the Friends of the John Dickinson Mansion. And my parents were in that first group of people that were in the Friends of the John Dickinson Mansion. And even though they were stationed his last place in Augusta, Georgia, my parents drove up here every year to the annual meeting. And they gave money to the conference, and they gave money to the mansion, and to the first book. Well, the fellow who wrote it was at the college, and they knew him. So it's been a wonderful trip for me because I've lived in 10 different states, and I just have 4 pictures to show you. And maybe you have seen this. And I will put these 4 pictures on this table. So at the end, if you want to come look more closely to them, you can. But here's the first one. It says, John Dickinson, Americans' Rights Advocate, and it was a lecture by Randy Holland. And I went to that with my daughter. And so every time there was something about John Dickinson up here in the paper, I would call my children. I have 2 sons and 2 daughters. One son lives in Oregon and one lives in Florida, and the 2 girls live in both ends of North Carolina. But they are both Dickinson advocates. And so this is a Randy Holland. How many people might have been there? Was it? Yeah, I think some of them were. So that's my first picture. Now, the second one is a picture taken at the University Delaware, and there was a talk, there was an article in a lot of original writings by John Dickinson. It was the copy of his letters from the farmer in Pennsylvania. And my son quit work and flew all the way up here to go to this museum at the University of Delaware to see that. That just shows how interested my children were about being related to John. Now, people say, now how are you related to John? Well, there was a Dickinson, a merchant in London, and he had several sons. And one, after he died, his wife and two of the sons came to Accomack in the other side of Virginia. Well, one of them went to Virginia, one went to Maryland. So I'm from the relations of the ones in Virginia. And they didn't dot their I. So everybody thought it was an E. And they just became Dickensons. It's just one branch. You know how that happened. Because in the 1700s, they didn't pay much attention to whether they should dot the I or make a loop. And sometimes they made a loop and dotted it, or didn't know what they did. Now, my husband worked for DuPont, our 4 children, but I've lived here 50 years, so you can do the arithmetic. I worked with the Delaware Humanities Forum doing famous women in costume, and if they were singers, I sang their songs. And so here I am as Mrs. Dickinson. Now, this is not like Mrs. Dickinson because on the cover of this book that I have, and she was a Quaker, but she was from a very wealthy Quaker in Philadelphia. And she had on a bright red dress. Now, when we think of Quakers, we think, well, they're very conservative and they never wear a red dress. Well, she was from a Philadelphia branch, and she was well dressed. And she wore red. Well, when I went to impersonate her, I couldn't come in a red dress and say, oh, nobody likes it. Well, they didn't dress like that in the 1700s. See what I mean? So I go like this. And I will put these up here, you see, so you can see them. And just have one more. Now, I get interesting phone calls. And one day I got a phone call from a man I didn't know, and he said, are you a Dickinson? And I said, yes. And he said, can you walk 2 miles? I said, yes. Even if it rains? I said, yes. He said, well then, we need you to walk in a big parade to celebrate the anniversary of the signing of the Constitution. And I need somebody to be related to John Dickinson, who was a signer. And I said, but I'm not a direct descendant. He said, I know that. He didn't have any people after him because he had 2 daughters and he had 3 sons. But the 3 sons died when they were little boys. And he had 2 daughters, and neither one of them had a son. So you're my only hope. And he said, you know, can you walk a mile? Can you, even if it rains? And so I did. I walked the mile. I carried a big post like this with his name on the top. And look, here is how I looked. And you can just pass that around because people want to see it. It was an amazing event. And afterwards, each of the signers' relatives, we all got together and they said, well, somebody else had the idea and they already had the papers, and they said, we're going to form a new organization that's called Descendants of the Signers. And you're going to be in it, and you're going to be related to John Dickinson with an I. And that's where I still am. And we meet once a year, and we go to a historic place in a historic town that was important even when John Dickinson was alive. And so I love to be here in Wilmington, and even when my mother was alive, there's a picture of her in the News Journal putting the wreath on John Dickinson's grave. So I'm just so happy to be here today, and thank you very much for inviting me.
Our next speaker is John Sweeney. John was the editor of the editorial page of the News Journal. His talk is going to be called John Dickinson, Evolution of a Patriot. He spent more than 40 years as a reporter and editor in Pennsylvania, Florida, Delaware. And he has been researching the pre-revolution struggle between John Dickinson and Benjamin Franklin to define what America is. It's a real treat to have John Sweeney with us today. John?
Thank you. A point of trivia that one of my sons just pointed out to me, that the motto of Kentucky is united we stand, divided we fall. You know where that's from? We just heard it sung. And Kentucky gives credit to John Dickinson and the Liberty Song for coming up with that famous phrase. So he's touching us in many ways. Before I go on with a short talk, I promise it will be short, I want to note three things that have happened to the John Dickinson community, if you will, since we had the last time we had a large gathering. Last year there were just a few of us diehards out there in the cold, and we laid the wreath. But first, thanks to the General Assembly and Governor Carney for funding a lot of research, a new around the world. But let me move on to my story for today. It's about an obscure piece of writing by John Dickinson. Most of us are familiar with letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania, and some of his other essays and so forth. But he was the penman of the Revolution, right? And what does that mean? That meant a lot of times he wrote the official paper for the Continental Congress and for the Delaware Assembly and so forth, and for his side in political battles. He was a very intelligent man with an orderly mind, a great lawyer. So another thing you have in common, right? And he had a nice writing style, and he could pull these things together. But in 1774, make a note of that date, he was just added to the Pennsylvania delegation of the Continental Congress, the first Continental Congress. It was near the end of it. And he came up with something that he was called upon to do, and you know what? It was a failure. It had an intention, but it never came off. He wasn't, despite the good job he did, he wasn't able to pull it off. And what it was simply a letter. It's a long letter, it's a little complicated, but it's worth reading. It's a letter to the inhabitants of Quebec. It's known as the first letter to the inhabitants of Quebec. And I would suggest to all of us, for homework, go online, read it on Wikipedia and so forth. It takes a little work, but it is worth taking a look at. Now, if we go back and think about the background of this, December 16th, 1773, it was the Boston Tea Party, right? The tea was thrown into the harbor. The word of it got to Parliament. by January 20th, 1774, the reaction in England was one of outrage. Parliament, leaders in Parliament, even the king said, we're going to have our revenge on the Americans. They will be punished. So very quickly, they passed 4 laws. Today, we know them as the coercive acts or the intolerable acts, right? They closed Boston Harbor. They changed the government, made it a military government in Massachusetts. They changed the Massachusetts criminal system. Certain crimes could not be tried by Massachusetts residents or juries and so forth. They bypassed that. And they also passed the Quartering Act. The 4 acts known as the intolerable acts. But there's a debate in history as to whether there was a 5th act. And that 5th act was the Quebec Act. The British said no, it wasn't, that they had been thinking about it for several years. Remember, Britain took control of Quebec province in 1763 at the end of the French and Indian War, and that Treaty of Paris. And they had imposed a British-style government on Quebec. But there were a number of people in Britain, in Parliament, land speculators in New York, Pennsylvania, and Virginia were stopped. They couldn't go any farther. There was a line. They were leaving their own colonies. What Dickinson gave them was no arguments. He wasn't angry. He gave them soothing words. He addressed them as fellow subjects of the crown. We're in this together. We share these same human rights. And what he did is he gave them essentially a Bill of Rights. This is in 1774. He gave them a Bill of Rights outlining practically everything that shows up in the 1791 Bill of Rights. It's all laid out. And many of the protections that are offered in the Constitution about how a government should operate. The Canadian campaign was a failure, and eventually Canada, Quebec would stay under British control, and the French Canadians would stay speaking French and following their own rules to this day. One Canadian historian, 20th century Canadian historian, said John Dickinson's letter was the Bill of Rights Canada never got, right? Making Canada the 14th colony. The Treaty of Paris, 1783 came, and the boundaries, the current boundaries between Canada and the United States were set, likely on Ohio and Michigan and so forth, all became states in the United States. So in that way, Dickinson failed. But if it were a failure, it had to be a magnificent failure. And I think it's just another aspect of this guy that we need to study. It's an obscure document. Go online, read it. You have to study it. The language is not the clearest, but it's all there. It's written like a lawyer. No offense. But it is all there. If you follow it, I think you'll be impressed with it. Thank you.
No one else can claim it. But we also have some other history here, too, that's very important. Of course, Lafayette visited Quaker Hill. Washington visited Quaker Hill. Thomas Garrett, the great station master of the Underground Railroad, was sitting in these seats right here. Harriet Tubman visited Quaker Hill many times into the history of John Dickinson. And one of the projects that the Friends of Dickinson Mansion funded was funding Jane Calvert to study the history of John Dickinson. Evelyn will lay the wreath, and then if we'd all observe just a moment of silence. There we go. That's fine.